I bought a rusted-out BMW for $100 at a county impound sale. 3 days later, while I was vacuuming out the trunk, my fingers caught on a loose seam in the carpet lining, and underneath it I found a single-folded lottery ticket worth $9 million, along with a letter that made my stomach drop before I had even finished reading the first line. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Rachel Kowalski, and at the time all of this happened, I was 42 years old, living in a rented duplex on the west side of Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the kind of neighborhood where the stucco is always a slightly different shade of tan than the house next to it. My husband, Danny, died 3 years earlier in a highway accident on his way home from a night shift, and I had spent those 3 years learning how to be a single parent by trial and a great deal of error. I still remember the exact weight of the phone in my hand when the hospital called, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hadn't finished folding the laundry, as if that mattered, as if anything ordinary would ever feel the same size again after that call. Grief, I learned, doesn't leave in one clean piece. It just gets smaller and quieter and learns to sit in the passenger seat instead of taking the wheel. I worked as a claims processor for a regional health insurance company, a job that paid enough to keep the lights on and not much more. Most days I reviewed denied claims from people who had no idea a stranger in a cubicle in Albuquerque was deciding, on paper, whether their surgery counted as medically necessary. It wasn't a job I loved, but it was steady, and steady mattered more to me by then than almost anything else. My son, Owen, was 14, quiet in the way that boys get when they've had to grow up faster than they wanted to, and he had his father's habit of chewing the inside of his cheek when he was thinking hard about something. He'd started doing the dishes without being asked the year Danny died, a small unspoken agreement between us that neither of us ever said out loud. We drove a Ford Taurus with a check engine light that had been on so long I'd stopped noticing it, and every month felt like a small negotiation with the calendar to make sure rent came out before the account had zero. I kept a folder in my kitchen drawer labeled Simply If, containing every scrap of paperwork I thought I might need someday for an emergency I couldn't yet name. That folder, it turned out, had no idea what was coming. I had never in my life bought a car at auction. But a co-worker of mine, a woman named Priscilla who processed dental claims 2 cubicles down, mentioned that Bernalillo County was running an abandoned and impounded vehicle sale on a Saturday morning at the Public Works yard, and that she'd once picked up a decent pickup truck there for $300. Owen needed a second car eventually. He was a year from his learner's permit, and I liked the idea of having something reliable waiting for him that wasn't the Taurus, which I still needed for myself. So on a warm October Saturday, I drove out to the yard, mostly out of curiosity, telling myself I wouldn't actually bid on anything. The yard was full of exactly what you'd expect: repossessed trucks, a school bus with a shattered windshield, a scattering of sedans that had clearly been sitting for years under tarps that had long since rotted through. There was a folding table set up near the gate with a coffee urn and a stack of clipboards, and men in reflective vests calling out lot numbers over a loudspeaker that crackled every few sentences. I stood near the back of the crowd in my sneakers and old jeans, feeling distinctly out of place among people who clearly did this for a living, flipping cars for a few $100s of profit at a time. And near the back fence, half in shade, sat a 1987 BMW 528e, silver gray under a heavy film of desert dust, with a cracked side mirror and a rear bumper that was being held on, as far as I could tell, mostly by hope. The auctioneer said it had been towed from a storage unit facility 11 months earlier after the unit's lease lapsed, and nobody ever claimed the vehicle inside. There was no title dispute, no criminal hold, nothing complicated, just an old car nobody wanted enough to pay the storage fees on. The opening bid was $100. Nobody else raised a hand. A man beside me muttered something about the transmission probably being shot on a car that old, and laughed a little, like the whole lot was a joke not worth his time. I don't fully know what made me raise mine. Maybe it was the shape of the car, something almost dignified about it under all that dust, like it was embarrassed to be seen this way, the way a person looks when they've been left somewhere they didn't choose to be left. I paid the $100 in cash, signed the paperwork at the folding table, and stood there for a moment afterward feeling faintly ridiculous, wondering what exactly I thought I was going to do with a 37-year-old German sedan that hadn't run in almost a year. I had it towed to a mechanic friend of mine named Gus, who'd fixed the Taurus more times than either of us could count, and who agreed to look the BMW over properly before I let Owen anywhere near the driver's seat. Gus called me on Tuesday to say the engine was actually in decent shape for its age, that it would need brakes and a battery, and probably new tires before it went anywhere serious, but that it wasn't the money pit he'd expected. I picked it up that evening and drove it home slowly, getting used to the way it pulled slightly to the left, and I parked it in the driveway next to the Taurus, feeling unreasonably proud of myself for a $100 decision that hadn't blown up in my face yet. I decided to clean it out properly before doing anything else with it. On Thursday evening, after Owen went to bed, I pulled out my shop vac and a bucket of soapy water and started on the interior. The previous owner, whoever they'd been, had left almost nothing behind. No registration, no personal items, just a faded gas station receipt wedged under the passenger seat and a McDonald's cup in the door pocket that had dried into something crusted and ancient. I worked through the front seats, then the back, then popped the trunk to vacuum that out too. The trunk carpet was loose along one seam near the spare tire well, the kind of thing that happens after decades of heat and cold cycling through a car that spent time both parked outside and, apparently, stored somewhere dry for years. When I ran the vacuum attachment along that edge, the carpet lifted slightly, and I noticed something flat and rigid underneath it, pressed against the metal of the trunk floor. I set the vacuum down and knelt there for a second, the way you do when your hands already suspect something your brain hasn't caught up to yet. The garage was quiet except for the tick of the ceiling fan and, somewhere down the block, a neighbor's dog barking at nothing in particular. I remember noticing how cold the concrete felt through my jeans, how ordinary that Thursday evening had been up until that exact second. Dishes still in the sink, a load of Owen's laundry going in the dryer. Nothing about the night suggesting it was about to split itself into a before and an after. I peeled the carpet back the rest of the way. Underneath it, sealed inside a gallon-sized freezer bag that had been taped flat against the metal, was a single lottery ticket and 2 folded sheets of lined notebook paper. I sat back on my heels in the garage, the freezer bag in my lap, and just looked at it for a moment before I opened it. The ticket was a Powerball ticket, purchased at a gas station in Rio Rancho, dated 11 months and 6 days earlier. I don't play the lottery. I didn't even know, sitting there, how to read the numbers properly, whether it meant anything at all. I unfolded the notebook paper instead. The handwriting was uneven, looping in some places and cramped in others, the handwriting of someone writing in a hurry or in pain or both. It began without a greeting. If you are reading this, it means I never found the courage to come back for it myself, and that frightens me more than dying does. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 79 years old. This car belonged to me for 31 years, and I hid what matters most to me inside it because it was the only place in my life my son could not reach. That was the sentence that made my hand start shaking. I read it 3 more times before I made myself keep going. Eleanor's letter explained that she had taught middle school English in Corrales, just north of Albuquerque, for 34 years before retiring. She had 2 sons. The younger one, Daniel, had died 8 years earlier in a construction accident, leaving behind a daughter, Ivy, who would have been about 22 by the time I found the letter. The older son, Bradley, was a financial advisor who managed his own small practice out of an office in Nob Hill, and it was Bradley, Eleanor wrote, who had spent the last several years slowly, methodically taking control of everything she had. She described it carefully, the way someone describes a wound they've had time to examine from every angle. After a fall in her kitchen 2 years earlier that fractured her hip, Bradley had moved her into an assisted living facility and taken over her finances to simplify things, as he put it. He had her house sold within 4 months. He consolidated her accounts under his management. He told her, gently and repeatedly, that she was starting to forget things, that her judgment couldn't be fully trusted anymore, though Eleanor insisted in the letter, in the same firm handwriting Edward Harmon might have recognized in a different story entirely, that her mind was, in her words, as sharp as the day I diagrammed my first sentence on a chalkboard in 1968. She wrote that Bradley had also, over that same period, systematically cut off contact between Eleanor and her granddaughter Ivy. He told Eleanor that Ivy had stopped returning calls, that Ivy was busy with her own life, and didn't want the burden of an aging grandmother. He told Ivy, Eleanor had later learned through a mutual acquaintance, that Eleanor's memory had declined so much that visits upset her that it was kinder to stay away. 2 lies, aimed at 2 people, each one designed to keep them from comparing notes. It had worked for nearly 3 years. Eleanor wrote that she had tried, more than once, to call Ivy directly from the facility's shared phone in the hallway, only to be told by staff, on Bradley's written instruction filed with her care plan, that outgoing calls needed to be supervised for her own protection. She described the particular humiliation of having to ask permission to phone her own granddaughter, of being watched while she dialed, of Bradley later telling her gently that the attempted calls were further proof her judgment couldn't be trusted, that a woman in her right mind wouldn't need to sneak around her own son's rules. She wrote, too, about smaller cruelties that had accumulated the way small cruelties do. Bradley selling her piano, the one she taught Daniel, and, briefly, Ivy to play on, without asking, while Eleanor was still recovering from her hip surgery and unable to protest effectively. Bradley redirecting her mail to his own address to keep things organized. Bradley telling the facility staff, in front of Eleanor, that she sometimes said things that weren't true, planting the seed of doubt so thoroughly that by the end, even people who liked Eleanor had started prefacing her stories with a gentle, pitying qualifier. Eleanor wrote that she had bought lottery tickets occasionally for years, a $5 indulgence she allowed herself every couple of weeks, cash she kept separate from the accounts Bradley controlled because the assisted living facility gave her a small weekly allowance in cash for exactly that kind of thing. 11 months before I found the letter, one of those tickets had matched. She said she found out from the television in the facility's common room that she sat perfectly still through the number announcement, and that she did not tell a single living soul because she understood immediately, with total clarity, that if Bradley learned about it, the money would vanish into his hands within a week the same way everything else had. She wrote that she had asked one of the aides who drove her to appointments to stop at the old storage unit where she still kept a few boxes and the BMW, and that on that visit, alone for 11 minutes while the aide waited outside, she hid the ticket in the trunk lining, the one place she was certain Bradley would never think to look because Bradley did not know the storage unit still existed. He believed she'd sold or scrapped the car years earlier. The letter's final paragraph was addressed, like Edward's had been in a story I'd tell in a different video sometime, to whoever found it. Please, Eleanor had written, find my granddaughter Ivy. Her last name is Voss, same as mine. She was living in Santa Fe the last I heard, working at a veterinary clinic. Tell her I never stopped loving her, that I never asked her to stay away, that all of it was a lie her uncle told to keep us apart and to keep this money for himself. If the ticket has expired by the time someone finds this, then I am sorry, and I hope you will at least tell her the truth about what happened to her grandmother. If it hasn't expired, then please, whatever it costs you, do not let Bradley anywhere near it. I sat on the garage floor for a long time after that, the ticket and the letter in my lap, the smell of vacuum dust and old vinyl still hanging in the air around me. I looked up the ticket's draw date on my phone with hands that were not entirely steady and found what I already feared. Most states give winners somewhere between 90 days and a year to claim a prize, and New Mexico's window was 180 days from the draw date for a ticket like this one. 11 months had already passed. According to what I was reading, the deadline had passed weeks ago. I nearly cried right there in the garage. Not for myself, but for Eleanor, imagining her waiting in that facility, hoping someone would find the ticket in time, not knowing the clock had already run out before anyone even started looking. I read the letter a fourth time, searching for a date, anything that might change the math, and found it in a line I'd skimmed past the first 3 times. Eleanor had written the letter and hidden the ticket on the same afternoon, and she dated the top of the second page. A small detail I'd missed because the ink had faded against the blue lines of the notebook paper. The date she'd written was almost 2 months earlier than the ticket's own printed purchase date. I stared at that for a full minute before I understood what it meant. Eleanor hadn't hidden the ticket the day she bought it. She'd hidden it, then apparently returned to the storage unit a second time months later and updated the letter, or possibly written a new one entirely, because there were 2 sets of handwriting pressure on the page, one lighter, one heavier, like she'd gone back over certain words to make sure they'd still be legible. Which meant the deadline wasn't necessarily what I'd first calculated. I needed to know exactly when this ticket had to be claimed by, and I needed to know soon, because if there was still a window, it was closing. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly overhead, running the numbers over and over in my head, trying to decide whether 19 days was a lot of time or almost none at all, depending on how many things could go wrong along the way. Around 2 in the morning I got up, checked on Owen, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the edge of his bed the way he'd slept since he was 6, and stood in his doorway for a long minute thinking about how quickly a life could tilt sideways, for better or worse, without any warning at all. In the morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years, sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and 3 cups of coffee, and started pulling threads the way I imagine anyone would when $9 million and a dying woman's last wish had landed in their lap over the course of one Thursday evening. The New Mexico Lottery's public information line, when I finally got through to a human being after 20 minutes on hold, would not confirm or deny anything about a specific unclaimed prize, citing privacy rules, but the representative did tell me, once I explained I'd found what I believed was an unclaimed high-tier winning ticket, that claim deadlines were calculated strictly from the draw date printed on the ticket itself, not from any other date, and that if the ticket was validated as a jackpot tier winner, I would need to bring it to lottery headquarters in Santa Fe in person along with identification. What she wouldn't tell me was whether the window had already closed. For that, I needed the exact deadline calendar, which the lottery's own website, it turned out, published publicly for every draw of the year. I found the relevant draw date, cross-referenced it against the 200-day window New Mexico actually allows for this ticket amount, which is longer than the shorter window smaller prizes get, and did the math 3 times to be sure. There were 19 days left. 19 days. I sat with that number for a long moment, feeling the shape of the whole situation rearrange itself around me. This wasn't a story anymore about researching a dead woman's family at my leisure. This was a countdown, and everything I did from that point forward needed to happen inside it. I photographed the ticket, front and back, in careful lighting. I photographed both pages of the letter, every line. I photographed the freezer bag and the tape marks on the trunk carpet where it had been hidden. Then I drove straight to my bank and rented a safe deposit box that same morning, something I had never once needed in my life, and I put the physical ticket and letter inside it, because I understood, even in my panic, that documentation and chain of custody were about to matter enormously. My plan, such as it was, had 3 parts: confirm exactly who Eleanor Voss was and what had happened to her, find Ivy Voss before those 19 days ran out, And figure out, with the ticket sitting in a safe deposit box and a fortune balanced on a deadline, how in the world to make sure Bradley Voss never got near a single dollar of it. Eleanor was not hard to find. A search of local assisted living facilities near Corrales turned up a woman by that name at a place called Sandia Vista Senior Living, and a call to the front desk, where I said only that I was trying to reach a former resident, got me a gentle but final answer. Eleanor Voss had passed away 5 weeks earlier, quietly, in her sleep, according to the woman on the phone, who offered her condolences to someone she assumed was family. 5 weeks, which meant Eleanor had died believing, as far as I could tell, that she had already run out of time, or close enough to it that she likely never learned the deadline had a little more room in it than she'd feared. I sat with that fact for longer than I probably should have, given the countdown running in the background of everything. Her obituary, when I found it, had run in the Albuquerque Journal 10 days after her death. It was short, generic, the kind of notice that gets written by someone checking a box rather than someone grieving. It listed her as a beloved mother and devoted educator, survived by her son Bradley Voss of Albuquerque. No mention of Ivy, no mention of Daniel, her deceased son, not even as a note that he'd predeceased her. Bradley had written his niece out of his mother's death the same way, it seemed, he had spent years writing her out of his mother's life. Finding Ivy took most of that first frantic day. Corrales Small Animal Clinic had a veterinary technician on staff named Ivy Voss. According to a staff photo on the clinic's website, a young woman with dark curly hair and her grandmother's same stubborn set to her jaw. If the one photo of Eleanor I could find in an old school yearbook archive was any indication. I did not call the clinic. I drove there instead, on the second afternoon, and waited in the parking lot until I saw a young woman matching the photo come out at the end of her shift, still in blue scrubs, keys in hand. She had her keys threaded between her fingers already, the way women learn to walk to their cars whether or not they'd ever admit why, and I made sure to stop a good distance away and keep my hands where she could see them. "Ivy," I said, walking toward her carefully, hands visible, the way you approach someone you don't want to frighten. "I'm sorry to just show up like this. My name is Rachel. I bought your grandmother's old car at an auction, and I found something inside it that belongs to you." She stopped walking. Her whole posture changed, the particular stillness of someone bracing for one more piece of bad news in what had probably already been a bad month. "My grandmother," she said carefully, "died 5 weeks ago. Nobody told me until after the funeral. My uncle didn't even call. I told her I was so sorry, and that I had a letter from Eleanor I needed her to read, and that it explained everything, and that I also needed to talk to her about something with an actual deadline attached to it, which I understood was an enormous amount to drop on a stranger in a clinic parking lot." She looked at me for a long moment, and something in her face told me she had spent 3 years wondering exactly what had gone wrong between her and the grandmother she used to be close to, and that some part of her had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to finally hand her an answer. We sat in my car with the engine off while she read the letter. She read it twice. When she got to the paragraph naming her, her hand came up and pressed flat against her mouth, and she made a sound I won't try to describe, because it wasn't really a sound meant for anyone else to hear. When she finished, she looked up at me with her eyes wet and asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether any of it was real, whether the money was real. Then she asked a second question, quieter than the first, one I don't think she meant to say out loud. "Did she really try to call me?" He told me she didn't want to. I told her that her grandmother's handwriting said otherwise on 2 separate pages written weeks apart, and that from what I could see, Eleanor had spent her last years thinking the exact same thing about her, that Ivy was the one who'd stopped wanting contact. Ivy put both hands over her face at that and just sat there for a while, breathing, and I let her because there wasn't anything useful I could have said into that particular silence. I told her it was real, that it was sitting in a safe deposit box at my bank, and that we had 19 days, now down to 17, to figure out how to claim it the right way without her uncle finding out before it was secured. That evening I called an old college friend of mine, a woman named Priya Anand, who had gone into estate and elder law and now worked at a small firm downtown. I hadn't spoken to her in almost 2 years beyond the occasional holiday text, but she agreed to meet me the next morning before her first appointment, and I brought everything: the photographs, the ticket, the letter, my notes on the claim deadline. Priya read through it all without interrupting, the particular quiet focus of someone doing careful math behind her eyes. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me over her glasses. "Legally," she said, "the ticket most likely belongs to you. You purchased the vehicle in a lawful auction. The ticket was found inside it, and there's reasonably established precedent that finders of property inside something they legitimately purchased have a strong claim. But," and she held up a finger before I could feel too relieved, "Eleanor's letter is not a legal document in the way a will is. It's a moral instruction, a deeply compelling one, but it doesn't automatically bind you or the lottery commission to pay Ivy anything. If you walk into lottery headquarters and claim this as your own winning ticket, which you would be within your rights to do, Ivy gets nothing unless you choose to give it to her voluntarily." "That's not a question," I told her. "I already know what I'm doing with it. I need you to help me do it in a way Bradley can undo." Priya nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer and respected it. She explained that the cleanest path was for me to claim the prize as the ticket's rightful owner, since New Mexico law didn't require me to prove anything about Eleanor's intentions to collect it, and that afterward I could execute a formal, documented gift or structured transfer of funds to Ivy, ideally routed in a way that acknowledged Eleanor's written wishes without ever putting the ticket itself, or the claim process, in a position where Bradley could insert himself as next of kin and argue that any lottery winnings connected to his mother's property belonged to her estate, and therefore to him. "There is a risk," Priya added more seriously now. "If Bradley finds out about this before you claim it, and if he can convince a court that the ticket was Eleanor's property at the time of her death, rather than yours by right of the vehicle purchase, he could try to freeze the claim entirely while ownership gets litigated. Given your deadline, that alone could cost you the whole prize. We need to move fast, and we need to move quietly." She tapped her pen against the edge of the desk, thinking. "The good news, if there is any, is that a frozen claim with a hard external deadline is exactly the kind of thing courts are reluctant to sit on. Judges don't like watching $9 million evaporate over a jurisdictional argument. But I'd still rather never test that theory if we can avoid it entirely." "There's one more thing," Priya said, before I left her office that first morning. "You need to decide right now whether you're doing this quietly or whether you're prepared for it to become a fight. Because the moment you walk into lottery headquarters with a ticket found in a dead woman's car, and the moment her son finds out, which he will, you are not going to be able to undo that decision." "Are you sure?" I told her I was sure. I thought about Eleanor writing that letter in a hurry, hiding it in the one place her own son would never think to look, trusting a complete stranger with the last thing she had left to give, and I told Priya that whatever came next, I wasn't going to be the second person in Eleanor Voss's life who let her down. We moved fast. Priya helped me prepare the claim paperwork that same week, working with a specialist attorney she brought in who had handled lottery claims before, someone who understood exactly which boxes needed checking to establish clean title. I drove to Santa Fe on the 11th day of the countdown with the physical ticket, my identification, the auction bill of sale for the BMW, and Priya beside me for good measure. The claims officer at lottery headquarters ran the ticket, confirmed the win, and told me, with an expression that suggested this happened more often than I would have guessed, that the jackpot share attached to this particular ticket, after required withholding, came to just over $9 million, payable as a lump sum if I chose that option, which I did, because a woman hiding cash in an assisted living facility so her son couldn't find it did not strike me as someone who would have wanted her granddaughter waiting decades for annuity payments. It took 11 business days for the claim to process and the funds to land, which meant I spent nearly 2 weeks after that Santa Fe visit in a strange state of suspended reality, going to work, making Owen's lunches, driving the newly repaired BMW around town like nothing extraordinary had happened, all while $9 million moved slowly and invisibly through a banking system somewhere. Bradley found out on a Tuesday, 17 days after the funds cleared, though I still don't know exactly how. Priya suspected someone at the Lottery Commission's Public Disclosure Office had leaked it, since New Mexico, unlike some states, does require winner information to eventually become part of the public record after a short delay unless specific anonymity provisions apply, and apparently mine hadn't fully shielded me the way I'd hoped. Whatever the source, my phone rang that Tuesday evening from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a man's voice, clipped and controlled, introduced himself as Bradley Voss. "I understand," he said, without any greeting beyond his name, "that you claimed a lottery prize using a ticket that was found in my mother's vehicle. My mother, who passed away recently, and whose estate I am the sole administrator of. I'd like to understand how you came to be in possession of that ticket." I told him, calmly, that I had purchased the vehicle legally at a county auction, and that anything found inside it belonged to me under the law, and that I didn't feel obligated to explain further to someone I'd never met. "That's an interesting position," Bradley said, "given that my mother's cognitive state in her final 2 years was significantly compromised. Anything found in her possession, or hidden by her, in that condition, raises serious questions about her legal capacity to purchase or handle a lottery ticket at all, which would make it estate property regardless of where it was found. I'd strongly recommend you retain counsel." "I already have," I told him and hung up. He called 4 more times over the next 2 days. I stopped answering, but the voicemails told their own story, sliding steadily from a lawyer's careful phrasing about compromised capacity toward something sharper, something with an edge under it. The second voicemail mentioned, almost casually, that he knew where I worked. The third mentioned Owen's school by name, which was the moment my hand started shaking again, in a way that felt very much like that first Thursday evening in the garage. By the fourth message, he was no longer talking about legal capacity at all. He was talking about how people who involve themselves in other families' affairs for personal profit tend to regret it, how he had resources most people underestimated, how I had, in his words, picked the wrong family's tragedy to profit from. I saved every one of those voicemails to 2 separate devices and sent copies to Priya before I even let myself feel the fear all the way through. 3 days after that, a letter arrived by courier from a law firm downtown, for dense pages threatening a probate challenge, a claim of undue influence, and a civil suit against me personally for what the letter called unjust enrichment at the expense of a vulnerable decedent's rightful heir. Buried in the 3rd page was an offer. Bradley was willing to accept $1 million, paid directly to him, in exchange for dropping all claims and signing a full release and non-disclosure agreement. $1 million, out of 9, simply to make him disappear from a story he had already spent years trying to keep his own niece out of. I sat with that letter at my kitchen table the way I imagine anyone would, turning it over, doing the math on what $1 million would mean if I just paid it and moved on with the rest. A paid-off house, Owen's whole college fund secured twice over, a life genuinely changed even after handing over that much. Priya was blunt about it when I called her. "It's a nuisance offer," she said. "He's testing whether you'll fold. If you pay him $1 million now, he'll be back in 6 months arguing the settlement proves you knew your claim was weak." "Don't touch it." I didn't touch it. I also, for the first time since finding the letter in the trunk, told someone outside of Priya and Ivy what was actually happening. My sister-in-law, Danny's older sister Marisol, who had been the closest thing I had to family in Albuquerque since Danny died, and who I'd been keeping at arm's length out of some instinct to protect her from a mess I didn't yet understand myself. She came over on a Friday night with a rotisserie chicken and a 6-pack, and I told her the entire story from the auction yard to the courier letter, and she listened without a single interruption, which I have come to believe is one of the rarest and most valuable things a person can offer another person in crisis. "You're doing exactly what that woman asked you to do," Marisol said once I'd finished. "That's not nothing. That's not small." "It doesn't feel small," I told her. "It feels terrifying." "Those aren't opposites," she said, and refilled my glass. We sat out on the back step after that, not talking about Bradley at all anymore, just talking about Danny for a while, the way Marisol and I sometimes did when the world felt too heavy to hold on our own. And by the time she left that night, I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. Not safety exactly, but the sense that I wasn't carrying it entirely alone anymore. Bradley's next move came 10 days later, and it was not a phone call. It was Bradley himself, standing on my front porch on a Saturday afternoon with a woman I didn't recognize beside him, dressed like she'd come from a real estate open house rather than a confrontation. He introduced her as his wife, Colette. She was holding a small potted succulent, which she set on my porch railing with a gentle smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of gesture clearly meant to establish, before a single hard word had been spoken, that they were the reasonable ones here. I let them into the living room, mostly because Owen was at Marisol's for the afternoon, and I had already, quietly, turned on the voice recorder app on my phone and set it face down on the coffee table, having learned from Priya the day before that New Mexico only requires one party's consent to record a conversation, and that I counted as that party. Colette did most of the early talking, the same way, I would later think, a certain kind of spouse always seems to get sent in first, soft-voiced, sympathetic, reminding me repeatedly that nobody was judging me, that anyone would have been tempted by what I found, that Eleanor had been very confused in her final years, and that whatever she'd written in that letter reflected a mind that simply wasn't reliable anymore. Bradley sat beside her, nodding at appropriate intervals, letting her soften the room before he spoke. When he finally did speak, his voice had none of the warmth Colette had been performing. "You need to understand," he said, "that I spent years managing my mother's care, her finances, her medical decisions, entirely alone, while my brother's daughter made no effort to be part of her life. Whatever you think you know, from one letter written by a woman with documented memory issues, you don't know the reality of what our family went through. I know that Ivy tried to call her grandmother for over a year," I said, "and that Eleanor tried to call Ivy, and that somebody was telling each of them the other one didn't want contact. I know that from Ivy directly, and I know Eleanor wrote the same thing in her own hand." Something tightened in his jaw. "That letter is not admissible as evidence of anything," he said. "It's the ramblings of a woman under significant cognitive strain, and my attorneys will demonstrate that clearly." "Then let them demonstrate it," I said, "in front of a judge, with her actual medical records, not just your version of them." Colette's smile finally slipped. Bradley leaned forward, his voice dropping into something quieter and considerably colder. "You should think very carefully," he said, "about what a prolonged legal fight does to a single mother with one income and a 14-year-old son. I have resources you cannot begin to match. I can make this take years. I can make it cost more than you'll ever see, even if you eventually win. Think about what that does to your son's life while it drags on." I felt my pulse climb, the particular fear of hearing your child mentioned as leverage in a stranger's threat, but underneath the fear, something else settled into place too, something steadier. "That almost sounds like a threat," I said. "It's a fact," Bradley said. "Not a threat, a fact." Colette shifted slightly on the couch, glancing toward the door in a way that told me even she found the room's temperature had changed, that whatever script they'd rehearsed on the drive over had already gone somewhere neither of them expected. "You have a nice house," Bradley added, looking around my living room with an expression I can only describe as appraising, the same look I imagine he must have given his mother's kitchen the week he decided to sell her piano. "It would be a shame to spend the next 3 years of your life paying lawyers instead of enjoying it." They left a few minutes later, Colette's succulent forgotten on the porch, railing exactly the way, I would later learn, another woman's abandoned orchid had once been forgotten on a different porch in a different story entirely. I stopped the recording, sat in my living room with my heart still hammering, and called Priya immediately. I have 31 minutes of him threatening to bury me in litigation costs and implying consequences for my son if I don't back down. I told her. Is that enough? Send it to me right now, Priya said. That's not nothing, Rachel. That's very much not nothing. The civil hearing, once Priya filed to formally establish clean title to the winnings and to seek a protective order regarding Bradley's contact, landed on the docket 8 weeks later, in a modest courtroom on the 3rd floor of the 2nd Judicial District Courthouse in Albuquerque. By then, Priya's team had assembled considerably more than just my recording. Eleanor's medical records, subpoenaed from Sandia Vista, showed a cognitive assessment performed only 4 months before her death that rated her mental competency as fully intact, conducted, notably at Eleanor's own request after she'd overheard Bradley describing her to a facility nurse as increasingly confused. A staff social worker at the facility, a woman named Renata Ochoa who had grown close to Eleanor over her final 2 years, gave a statement describing repeated instances where Eleanor asked, sometimes in tears, why her granddaughter never visited or called, and instances where Renata herself had, out of concern, tried to reach Ivy directly through information Eleanor provided, only to be told by Bradley, when he learned of it, that such contact violated his wishes as his mother's designated representative and needed to stop. Ivy testified, too, describing the string of unreturned calls and the messages she'd been given secondhand, always through Bradley, claiming her grandmother didn't want to be bothered. She described finding out about Eleanor's death from a mutual family friend, 10 days after the funeral had already happened, an omission Bradley never fully explained to the court's satisfaction. Bradley's attorney argued, as Priya had predicted, that Eleanor's letter reflected impaired judgment and that any ticket found in her former vehicle should revert to her estate, of which Bradley remained the sole surviving heir under intestate succession rules, given that Daniel had predeceased Eleanor and, Bradley's attorney initially argued, grandchildren of a predeceased child did not automatically inherit unless the will specified it, except Eleanor had, it turned out, executed a simple will 4 years earlier, before Bradley had gained control of her finances, naming both of her sons and, in the event of Daniel's death, his descendants, as equal beneficiaries of her estate. Bradley had never updated it. Likely, Priya argued to the judge, because he never expected there to be anything meaningful left in the estate to divide by the time his mother died, having already extracted most of her tangible assets through the years of financial control preceding her death. The recording was submitted midway through the 2nd day of the hearing. I watched Bradley's face while his own voice played through the courtroom speakers, watched the particular stillness move across him the way frost moves across a window, watched his attorney's expression shift when the line about my son's life came through clearly for everyone in the gallery to hear. The judge, a measured, unhurried woman named the Honorable Diane Castellanos, asked for the recording to be replayed a second time before she made any comment at all, and when she finally spoke, her voice was flat and precise. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I want to be exceptionally clear that statements referencing a minor child in the context of pressuring a party to abandon legal proceedings will be given significant weight in this court's assessment of your credibility and your conduct throughout your mother's final years." Bradley did not testify well in his own defense. Under cross-examination from Priya's co-counsel, he grew visibly agitated, at one point insisting that everything he had done, every account he consolidated, every visit he blocked, had been necessary, and that nobody understood the burden he alone had carried. At one point his own attorney visibly winced as Bradley, unprompted, launched into a description of how much of his own time he'd sacrificed managing his mother's affairs, as though the court had asked him to justify a fee rather than answer for a pattern of isolation. Judge Castellanos let him talk longer than she needed to, I think, because every additional sentence seemed to make her decision easier rather than harder. It was, in its own way, the same story I would later hear was almost identical to one Priya had seen argued in another elder abuse case years earlier, the caretaker who becomes so convinced of his own sacrifice that he genuinely stops seeing where help ends and control begins. The judge did not rule from the bench that day. 3 weeks later, her written decision arrived. She found that the lottery ticket had been lawfully acquired by me as part of the vehicle purchase and was never estate property to begin with, resolving the core financial question entirely in my favor. She additionally found, in a separate section of her order, that Bradley's conduct as Eleanor's financial power of attorney holder in the 2 years preceding her death showed a pattern consistent with undue influence and isolation of a vulnerable adult from her family, and she referred that portion of the record to the district attorney's elder abuse unit for further review, alongside a formal accounting order requiring Bradley to produce complete financial records of every account he had, managed on his mother's behalf. That accounting, once it was finally compelled months later, revealed just over $600,000 moved from Eleanor's accounts into investment vehicles under Bradley's sole control during the final 2 years of her life, funds Priya was ultimately able to help recover a substantial portion of for Eleanor's estate, which under the terms of that old, never updated will, meant to pass jointly to Bradley and, through Daniel's line, to Ivy. Bradley, facing both the civil accounting order and a growing criminal referral, eventually agreed to a settlement that returned the recovered funds to the estate rather than risk a criminal trial, though the elder abuse investigation itself continued independently for some time after, well past anything I was still directly involved in. I gave Ivy $3 million from the lottery winnings, structured carefully through Priya's office as a documented gift, honoring exactly what Eleanor had asked of me in that letter, though honestly I would have given her more if she'd wanted it. Ivy used part of it to go back to school for veterinary medicine, something she told me she'd wanted since she was a kid following her grandmother's old dog around Eleanor's backyard in Corrales, and she bought a small house not far from that same neighborhood, close enough that she says she can still walk past her grandmother's old street when she wants to feel near her. I kept the rest. I paid off the duplex, then bought a modest house outright in the North Valley with actual space for a garden, something I hadn't let myself want in years. I set up a fund for Owen that will cover any college he wants to attend without either of us thinking twice about it. I quietly left my claims processing job about 8 months later, not out of spite, but because Renato Ochoa, the social worker from Eleanor's facility, reached out to me after the case concluded and asked whether I'd ever consider doing advocacy work, since I clearly understood the financial paperwork side of elder exploitation better than most people who come into that field. I now split my time between a small nonprofit that helps families navigate suspected financial abuse of elderly relatives and simply being around for Owen more than a demanding insurance job ever let me be. I kept the BMW. Gus finished the repairs properly a few months after everything settled. New tires, a repainted bumper, a battery that actually holds a charge, and it sits in my driveway now, not as a spare car for Owen anymore, though he does drive it sometimes, but as something closer to a keepsake. There's a small brass plate Ivy had made for the dashboard, small enough that most people would never notice it, engraved simply with Eleanor's name and the years of her life, and I have never once considered selling that car, no matter how many practical arguments I could probably make for doing so. I think about Eleanor Voss often, an English teacher who spent 34 years telling children how to find meaning buried inside a sentence, who ended up hiding the most important sentence of her own life inside a car door, trusting that someday, somehow, a stranger would take the time to read it properly and choose to care about what it said. Ivy and I have dinner every few weeks now, a habit neither of us planned, but neither of us has stopped. She keeps a photo of Eleanor on her nightstand, one from years earlier, the two of them standing together in Eleanor's old garden, both of them laughing at something the camera never caught. She told me once that she finally understands why her grandmother stopped calling, and that understanding it doesn't take away the years they lost, but it does mean she gets to stop wondering whether her grandmother had simply stopped loving her. That, Ivy said, was worth more to her than any amount sitting in a bank account, though she was quick to add, with a small laugh, that having both certainly didn't hurt. Owen, for his part, has taken to telling the story at every family gathering with steadily increasing embellishment, and I've stopped correcting the details, because I understand now that some stories are allowed to grow a little in the retelling, as long as the truth at the center of them stays exactly where it belongs. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I sit on my back porch with a cup of coffee and think about how close all of it came to never happening at all, how easily I could have skipped that auction yard on a Saturday morning, how easily that loose seam in the trunk carpet could have gone unnoticed for another decade, how easily 19 days could have become none at all if I'd hesitated even a little longer than I did. I don't think of myself as someone who did anything extraordinary. I think of myself as someone who happened to be paying attention at exactly the right moment, and who refused to look away once I understood what I was looking at. What would you have done if you'd found that ticket ticking down toward a deadline in the trunk of a $100 car with a stranger's whole family history unraveling in your hands? Think about it honestly and be truthful with yourself before you answer. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, tell me in the comments. I read every single one of them. Thank you, truly, for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. Some stories truly deserve to be found in time before the ticking clock runs out completely. I'm so grateful this one was.